Yeah, good. Hey,
Hi, Mark.
hey Matt.
Pleasure to
Good,
meet you.
good to meet you, man. Yay. Total
Mhm.
good. Sweet.
Yeah, really. As I said in my email, it's an honor and it's humbling to get to talk to you and Zach. Um, I have had a chance to spend a little time with Zach, but
Great.
yeah, great to connect with you. Where are you right now?
I'm I'm in Vermont. We have
Okay.
the think tank is in a big old one of those, big old Vermont houses up in the Northeast Kingdom.
Oh, lovely.
So Zach also has lived here. He's between here and Florida. And like there's like six, seven, you got to come up some point. There's six, seven bedrooms, like different scholars, different people kind of come in and spend time. So it's sweet Northeast Kingdom space. You know Vermont at all? You know this part of the world?
I've been to Burlington once and in the summertime and enjoyed it quite a bit. And yeah, I'd love to come back. Yeah, to visit you guys, and then there's the Sky Meadow
Right,
Institute
right, right.
that
Brendan, yeah, down
Brendan
the road.
is
Now,
running. So got to get to Vermont soon. Yeah,
got to get to Vermont soon. And you're in California, right? You're in San
Northern
Francisco.
California. I'm in Oakland. Yeah, across
You're
the
in,
bay from
you're in
SF.
babe. Yay, yay,
Yeah,
yay. And we cross deeply on participation, the participatory universe. And I
yeah,
think Jack mentioned to me you guys are doing a journal. Thanks, Shanti. Are doing a journal or something like that. So we're finishing. I actually just had a long talk with very lovely man, Jeffrey Krapel.
oh
Um,
yeah, that's fun. I was just with Jeff a few days ago actually, because he's down at Esalen, but he was coming through SF. So
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, I'd never spoken to we were aware of each other for a bunch of years, but we'd never spoken. So I
mhm.
actually was sharing with them. Maybe we'll get to talk about that today. This stuff I've been working on for like, a couple of decades now on the nature of story, the ontology of story.
Mhm.
And so we're kind of just finishing a monograph on kind of the participatory nature of story, how story is part of the story of cosmos, and how that is a very, very primary way of understanding participation. So Zach had told me that you guys had emailed
Exactly.
forth about writing something up. So maybe that would be a good topic.
Yeah, no, I'd love that. Hey, Zach. Mark and I couldn't help ourselves. We were getting into it already. The ontology of story and participation and all that. And yeah, I hope we can certainly touch on that. I've been reading. I finished this a few days ago and really loved it. And I think there's lots we can dig into there. And I know you guys have another book out on AI and have continued to write. And I guess maybe can we just dive in? I mean, I have
Sure,
a
sure.
question that I think can orient us to this Kairos
And
moment.
I will say, Zach, before Matt dives in, that I said to Matt, he's got to find his way up here to Vermont, and we'll drink some cider with him, and and hang out at some point. So that's a real invitation.
Totally. If you're there, I'll make it happen. I'll get there.
Thank you.
All
Yeah,
right.
I'm
Here
in.
we, okay.
You know, there's a my schedule is crazy until the end of September, but there's a conference that the Harvard Divinity School is hosting on Rudolf Steiner in December. And I don't know if you guys will be around, and maybe it's not the most ideal weather in Vermont around then, but I'll be in Boston or Cambridge at the end of the year. So I don't know. We
Let's
can
do
talk.
it. And that's a good time. Let's focus, time as duration. Let's
Mhm.
focus on entering into that space. Free will.
Great,
With
great.
delight. Yay.
So
Yes.
obviously, the Metacrisis has been ongoing for quite a time. I don't know how wide you guys would place that time frame, but things are always seem to be coming to an ever increasingly sharp, pointed head, and so we're on the verge now, probably closest to, the third World War than we've been. And I wonder in this type of a situation when zero-sum rivalrous dynamics and eye for an eye uh, ideologues seem to be in charge of all the weapons in the militaries of the world. What role can philosophy play? I mean, as philosophers, we like to engage in dialogue, and we seem so far from that being what guides the decisions that are, shaping the immediate future, and whether or not we will have a nuclear holocaust on our hands, right? So what's the role of philosophy right now? How can we feel like what we're doing here, the three of us, is meaningful when we're facing this type of um, rivalrous, revenge-based antagonism? What are we
Yeah.
what are we doing here right now? And
No,
how is what we're doing relevant?
yeah. No, it's I'll dive in and turn to Zach, but it's a great way to start because in some sense, there's always the question of, can we move history?
Mhm.
Right? Can we participate in the historical process? Can we be partners with the infinite, if you will, right, in history in some real way? And of course, there are very, pragmatic ways to engage politics. And we know of the traditions of philosopher kings, but in terms of where we are today at this moment, the conclusion that Zach and I came to probably in 2010, when we started the think tank, was that, if I could borrow Harris's, terminology, that social structure, new forms of regulation, law, et cetera, won't be able to address the meta crisis. And infrastructure, can we find bioweapons in the wastewater in a more efficient way? Won't be able to, although they're both necessary, but only, some version of superstructure, right? And we're focusing in superstructure on this notion of not just story, but story of value, right? And so our premise, but not a faith-based premise, but a kind of a radically empirical premise, kind of emerging from both the interior sciences and the exterior sciences, is that actually the single most effective thing we can do to respond directly to impending suffering is to actually enact a story of value, which is a context for our diversity, right, and which allows for conversation. Maybe just one more sentence, and then just to pass it on. But if you think about it for a second, Matt, and this is something that Zach and I have been talking about for, literally, we in our study process in what we call Holy of Holies, which is a lineage study. So we've kind of traced a thread, and we traced the thread from, at this moment of what we called many years ago the second shock of existence. This the death not of the human being but of humanity. You can actually trace a very direct thread from the need for coordination. Coordination can't happen, as I'm sure you read, can't happen without resonance. Resonance can't happen without coherence. Coherence can't happen without intimacy. You can't cohere without a sense of intimacy. And intimacy is always based, whenever I'm working with a couple, what's the first thing we talk about is their shared value, right? So if there's not a shared story of value, we can't create intimacy, which means we can't create very directly coherence or resonance, and then we can't create coordination. And since every existential risk is a global problem, and which will become a galactic problem, but let's just stay in the global for now. Let's kind of stay within the global before we go galactic and intergalactic, but it's a global problem. So without this kind of thread that goes from global coordination to resonance, coherence, intimacy, based on a shared story of value, we actually don't have a chance, right? So actually, from our perspective, when we talk to each other every day, we remind each other, although it doesn't need much reminder, that we're actually not an intellectual think tank. We're a kind of religious activist, world philosopher, kind of time between worlds, time between stories group, kind of madly intent on enacting and downloading this new story of value into culture, something like that. Just begin.
Yeah, love it. Lots to say, but let me let Zach chime in.
It's a great place to start because what the fuck? What are we doing? Like, there's stuff to do. We're just talking. My first response actually was that we need to qualify. We need to say something like philosophers like us, because it's also the case that philosophers make war. Philosophers justify war. There are bellicose philosophers. It's worth noting there are philosophies of just war, meaning philosophies about the wars that cannot be fought because of the existence and reality of value. And so I think we are philosophers of peace, fundamentally in love, although that's cheesy to say, but it's just the case that this is the nature of our like ontology makes us philosophers of peace and love. But you know, even our definition of eros includes the breaking. Like eros is the bringing together, but eros is also the distancing and the breaking, right? And so I'm not saying bring on the war, but I am saying we have to be able to transcend and include the philosophies that see war as a primary driver of the universe, like Heraclitus, you could argue Hegel, you could argue others, and even some traditions of the lineage would say you have to sometimes fucking go to war to protect. And so that's what I would say. It's not so simple as being philosophers of peace and love if you don't transcend and include the bellicose philosophers so that it's a fierce love that can actually protect. So that was my first reflection. Just remember, like, oh yeah, Heraclitus, like Deleuze, like a bunch of people who just like philosophers of war, you know, like Lao Tzu, excuse me, Sun Tzu, or pardon me. But even Lao Tzu, I think would say like, you know, is there anything outside of that? So it's very complicated. So but I love the frame. And I would say, obviously echoing Mark, that one of the things that drives war is very profound disagreements about value. Like what else could be at stake that's deep enough to drive you to kill and to at a large scale. And so there's something about what we work on, we call the eye of value. There's something about the ability to clarify the eye of value that is key to this.
Right.
And yeah, please. That would kind of be
well, just to be very concrete and specific in this instance, it seems to me that the tragedy here in the the epicenter of the war that's threatening to spiral out of control right now is that it seems to me that the Persian tradition and the Iranian people and the Israeli people have these deep, rich traditions and insights and are coming out of profound ancestral sources of wisdom. And so on some level, the values that these two societies are trying to protect they're not all that different. And yet there's a war breaking out because some sense of division that's very real, and threats have been made. But the tragedy seems to be that there is a deep source of value on both sides of this conflict that should be able to resonate. And what's blocking us? Is it the intimacy crisis that's blocking the resonance?
So let's play for a second. So Matt, let's, in the study hall of, the Talmud and the Aramaic traditions, there we can be fierce combatants and filled with love, right? So that's our premise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or we're good.
Just like in the Bhagavad Gita, and Krishna's
totally. So let's be just tenderly fierce combatants just for a second.
Yeah.
In other words, both of us, all three of us, are deeply familiar and resonant, for example, with the grandeur of, let's say, the Sufi traditions. And we all know that Rumi was one of thousands and thousands of Rumis, and that there's these incredible schools of just unimaginable depth. I think we take that as a given. And, I don't know how much you trace the scholarship of Maimonides' family, but Maimonides' son was very, very close to the Sufi schools and redefined kind of a certain moment in the medieval schoolmen. So all of that we take as a given, I think. Having said that, that's not what we're dealing with today, right? And what we're dealing with today is a regime that funds death cults. Hamas is a death cult.
Mm-hmm.
Hezbollah is a death cult, right? Which are challenging a pluralistic democracy, right? Rooted in a kind of a particular kind of field of value. And so I'd be hesitant to make a moral equivalence between those two governments, right? And that would scare me. And give me one more second, I'll pass it back to you. When I read this morning, and this is a really interesting question, I would love to hear your thoughts. So you read us, so I've read you a little bit this week, which I've had fun doing. I'd never, read you, so I picked up, I don't know, 4 or 5, I just kind of picked at, pretty random, and had super fun and totally enjoyed it. And it was wonderful. And so I picked up, what you wrote on this, on
nice.
Right. So I just, I can't read online. I got to print shit. So, I mean, there's a lot to say about what you wrote, but bracket that. But at the end, you wrote, wrote, whether or not one agrees with every proposition, overall invitation may still be worth considering. And then you wrote, to live as if value is real, as if story changes the world, as if love is not merely human sentiment, but the source energy of cosmogenesis. And I was struck by it. I was struck by the as if position, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just, I want to just throw on the table, when I was, I mean, God, this is a terrible thing to say, but when I was closer to your age than I am now, right? I sat and locked myself in a room and tried to look at Theodicy in some serious way. And I spent 6 months just kind of locked in a room in Jerusalem, reading every Theodicy I could, and and every possibility, and basically came to the conclusion that none of them stand. Theodicies don't stand in the face of burning children, right? I mean, obviously, and attempts to explain and use theologic to explain suffering are obscene in some kind of fundamental way. So that we have to hold uncertainty in a radical way, a kind of ontology of the void. We take the void seriously is a big yes. And we also get to hold the radical certainty that value is real, right? That it's not an as if position, and that we kind of can step out of that kind of postmodern fear that runs obviously way beyond. We could trace the intellectual line back, all three of us, each in different fructifying ways. And so I wondered about that, and I'll just again, just for full disclosure, what flashed in my mind as you kind of equated the sides in this conflict was the end of this, and I wondered, like, in other words, how do those things affect each other? And that's a really interesting conversation. And it's, are we willing to take a stand on some inherency of value, even though we understand that value is completely evolving, and radical diversity? We take all that as a given. Is that a worthwhile question that you'd like to, is interesting?
Yes. And let me, I didn't mean to create a moral equivalence between governments. Actually, I was talking about the peoples, the societies, and not necessarily the state apparatus in charge of
Right. No, great distinction.
Because I think the Iranian people deserve better than the government they have, and I would say the Israeli people deserve better than the government that they have. And in terms of the as if, I get the connection you're making, and I like that your mind leapt to that subtle link here. I mean, I'm not a pacifist. I'm not one who thinks that we have the luxury of not choosing sides in every conflict because we're above it. There are some conflicts that are unavoidable, and therefore we need a just war theory as philosophers to know when and how to engage. And when I say, what happens if we consider value and love and story and so on as if they were real expressions of cosmogenesis, the as if there is an invitation to my readers more so than it is the position that I myself am taking, because we have to begin from where the culture is, and the culture is in a place where, interestingly, I think we do take fiction very seriously. We're constantly seeking escape into fantasy. And so it's a bridge to the dominant culture, I think, to say, offer a participatory invitation. What if this were true? And then pragmatically speaking, I'm a pragmatist about these sorts of things. Maybe this works. Maybe living as if value were real makes value real. And that what the human being has is this power, to become detached from that, to live as if it were not real, or just something that we make up. And we see the consequences of that. The consequences of that are very destructive. And so, yeah, the as if is for my reader, and it's an invitation to trying to meet people where they're at and offer this pragmatic invitation to see how their lives might change if they took these ideas seriously.
Zack, good. I received. Thank you. There's so much to say, but we'll try and keep keep this moving and kind of move around the circle.
Yeah, there's a lot of subtlety here in what's being raised, because there's also the how to rhetorically engage with postmodern readers, and then how to even apply philosophical clarity about value to real existing political issues in a context where there's a sense-making crisis and decades of intergenerational propaganda warfare that makes it impossible to know what the hell is actually going on.
Right.
And then there's the philosophies of as if. So when I read that, I thought of William James. I thought of his theory of God, basically. And his theory of God is basically like a little bit Pascal's wagers, like post-empiricism, where it was kind of like, if you believe in God, people are happier, they have these crazy experiences. So he's kind of saying ontologically, why even get into that debate when it's just the proof is in the pudding that believing in God is like good for you, basically, is what I'm saying. And it's an interesting argument. But Josiah Royce and Charles Sanders Peirce would have none of that. They would have been like, dude, James, that's like, go to New Hampshire and do some nitrous. Just what James was doing when he was researching varieties of religious experience. But he abandoned the realism in favor of this radical pluralism, which was a kind of objective idealism, kind of implicit realism, but not the same position as Peirce. So it's just getting into some of the footnotes here. But to take it a deeper step back, we're in a culture that isn't able to speak about the most profound things. So the real question is here, what the fuck would you die for? Because the question about war is, why are people going to die? What would you die for? And there's these interesting sense of there is no such thing.
Right.
So in which case anyone dying for anything is being coerced. I'm not accusing you of this, Matt. I'm saying this is the mood of the culture. And so there's this question of what are the different sides dying for, ostensibly, meaning what is their ultimate motivation and the means by which they would execute that. And these become interesting questions. And then what are the things that stand in for that, which is to say that James talked about a moral equivalent of war. James Hillman talked about an aesthetic equivalent of war in his book, The Terrible Love of War. He spoke not of the moral motivation, but of the overwhelming aesthetic experience of war as something that humans were drawn to, and a profound kind of archetypal allurement towards that. So again, what are we really doing when we go to war? It's kind of what I'm saying. And it's a world's historical question, and we don't know how to resolve it. And if we don't resolve it now, we're all dead. Because it used to be you could go to war and it would kind of be heroic and like or something. And even if your civilization lost, there'd still be civilization somewhere that conquered you. Now we're in a situation where everybody fucking loses the war, period. Full stop. No survivor, no bunkers, none of that. Like if you're believing that, you're not understanding the nature of advanced weaponry. Think you have a bug out bunker, you don't. Right. So it's the end of everything is the result of the current war, which requires a different type of philosophical approach. I'd say a much wider consensus of humanity would prefer not to have everything die. That didn't used to be the argument against war. It used to be that side's bad, this side's good. Now we're basically saying like war is bad because it kills everything. Doesn't mean everyone's equally morally. Does not mean everything's equally morally. So there's this question, how do we then enforce moral standards in a context where we know we have to end war?
Right.
Like this.
I mean, no, that's good. I mean that, and back to you, Matt. Let me see if we can do a couple of things in between, and then we'll follow you. We're in your living room and on your podcast with a lot of delight. So it's very interesting. In the beginning of because I literally just read this now, so it's fresh in my mind, and I enjoyed the piece. And generally, I read more than I listen, so I didn't listen to the 4 or 5 things I didn't listen to. I read them. And so the reading for me is just a better art. And so you spoke in the beginning of kind of the purse shelling kind of the kind of analogies, and it's actually related to this broader conversation of how we approach war and how we rhetorically need to engage in this moment of metacrisis. So it's interesting. I don't read Peirce. I don't read Schelling. Don't really read Duchardon. Right. In other words, those are, Zack, in the David J. Temple world, Zack reads them and Ken does. Those are the parts of David J. Temple that read that world. And I live in 3 other worlds in a word. One is a kind of, what Zack and I call an anthrontological world, a kind of visionary anthrontological, interior world, which is actually probably my most important source, more than anything. But then I live very strongly, and Zack and I have spent maybe 15 years studying in this context, right? That's how we started, what we call Holy of Holies and what we call the Solomon lineage.
Mm-hmm.
So the first matrix of cosmoerotic humanism would be the mystical interior science lineage of, let's say, the Song of Solomon. That's actually, and there's an entire kind of hermeneutic tradition, a kind of mystical hermeneutics of the Song of Solomon, and that, Tohora Tzufa Hava, its insides are aligned with love. And of course, the texts that understand that all the books are holy, says Akiva, living at the time of Jesus, but only Song of Songs is Sanctum Sanctorum, and the Holy of Holies of Eros replaces the Holy of Holies of the temple, right? And and the lineage unfolds. And so for example, when I wrote kind of the academic thing, it was on the master in Hasidism who understood himself as being the inheritor of the lineage of Solomon. So that's Mordechai Leiner, and so I just because, you need to do these things in an academic context, it wasn't my favorite world. So I did it for Edel, but so there's an explicitly religious dimension, right? To cosmoerotic humanism, which is very explicit. It's world philosophy and religion. And of course, the third source, right? And this brings us back to war, is science. I'm a crazy, insane reader of the sciences, not so much physics, much more molecular biology, molecular chemistry, kind of just the hard sciences, right? As a text of revelation, and kind of bring those, together. So now back to war, and back to, and it's funny is, and again, I've been in conversation with you deeply the last 3-4 days, just reading you and enjoying it very much. And there was like almost these two voices, because that rhetorical move you made here at the end, and the 5 or 6 things I looked at, you made a number of other times. It's a move that you make. And so on the one hand, in one moment, I just feel your kind of your participatory power, imagination, Adam, which means imagination, not just ground. So homo imaginus, Matt's homo imaginus, and this kind of stunning, reach. And, I read a couple of things. We were talking about one of my favorite topics, which is number mysticism, how we experience numbers and time, and just gorgeous passages, really, really gorgeous and really, truly wondrous. And then you'd make this other rhetorical move. And I wonder if there's a way, not for you, but for all of us, because in essence, what we're trying to do as David J. Temple is make a different rhetorical move. It kind of cuts to the heart of what we're trying to do. And in a certain sense, let's say the meta-modern movement that's kind of at the outskirts of integral now is very different than what Ken intended when Ken started his integral move, right? In other words, they're kind of, again, refusing the kind of religious dimension, the homo religiosus in it. And I think we need to reclaim, that's what and in this case, Zack and I have been taught, we need to reclaim religion, right? And a new form of religion. And we need to be able to speak potently, powerfully, and proudly, and hold the divinity of our atheism, even as we hold the radical divinity of our trust, in a cosmoerotic universe. And that paradox, we know there's heresy, which is faith, and faith, which is heresy. So, we're heretics for all the small faiths, but on the other hand, so just, and it seems that I was really profoundly moved by your writing, which is why I'm taking this is a love note. This is like taking it very seriously. I wouldn't generally start a podcast in such a serious way, but it seemed like your voice is really important here. And so the possibility of moves seems to matter. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. No, I have been accused before when entering into, I don't know if it's debate. I don't like to debate, but fierce dialogue with people of being in the subjunctive mood too much. And I certainly, though, agree with you about the need for re-engagement with religion and even religious modes of expression, and faith, and to not just be in this meta-modern sincere irony thing, but to just be sincere sometimes. And I don't necessarily myself identify as, oh, I'm in the meta modern camp, or I'm in the integral camp, or if anything, I mean, usually I'm a process philosopher is what people call me, and what I feel comfortable just sort of, I'm in John Cobb Jr.'s lineage. I think in terms of my religious outlook, he's been an
Yeah,
important influence on me. Process theologian. He died in December.
it was a
But
great one.
yeah, so, but Peirce, you say you haven't read Peirce. Peirce is someone who I've had maybe how could I describe my relationship to Peirce? I'm not a Peirce expert, but I've read some of his major essays multiple times, and his neglected argument for the reality of God in particular, and this goes back to the as if thing and what you were saying, Zach, about the difference between James and Peirce. I mean, and Royce. You could throw Royce's absolute pragmatism in the mix too. Um, James was a nominalist, and his pluralism was a bit of a free for all, and it's fun. I mean, he's opening the door to a lot of very important ideas, but he's not really um, providing us with a solid basis for a new uh, religious outlook. He's more just saying, here are some possibilities. And I think Peirce, on the other hand, provides us with a more rigorous logical proof in a way for the existence of God. But it's still pragmatic, and I actually wanted to quote Peirce on this, where he says, this is from that essay on a neglected argument for the reality of God. He says, this argument, capital A, his argument, should present its conclusion not as a proposition of metaphysical theology, but in a form directly applicable to the conduct of life and full of nutrition for man's highest growth, right? So there's this pragmatic dimension to it. But then he goes on, he says, let religious meditation be allowed to grow up spontaneously out of pure play, capital P, without any breach of continuity, and the muser, capital M, will retain the perfect candor proper to musement. Enter your skiff of musement, he says, push off into the lake of thought and leave the breath of heaven to swell your sail. With your eyes open, awake to what is about or within you, and open conversation with yourself, for such is all meditation. So this is his account of religious meditation, and it's deeply imaginal, playful, really, musement. And so when I use terms like as if, it's really just it's my way of signaling there's a participatory element to you. This truth, the reality of value, it's not just waiting out there for you to find it. You have to become worthy of it, And so as if is just a way of trying to invoke the role that imagination plays in religious meditation and contemplation. Um, Not because it's not real, not because the divine or cosmic value aren't real, but because we need to imaginally body them forth
Yeah.
to maintain that reality. That's our role as human beings, is to maintain that reality through imaginative engagement, you know? So yeah, but I think you're totally right to say that there's this need to be more affirmative of these values as ontological. Um, I'm right there with you, and I have had arguments with Brendan Graham Dempsey, our friend, about this, who's more of an emergentist about these sorts of things, and I don't think that works, right? So I think on that issue we're
Yeah,
much more
great.
aligned than you might think,
Yeah, it was
given
great.
my rhetoric.
Great to put this at the center as you guide us into what part of the world you want to enter now. But it's a great conversation, important.
Sure. Did you want to say anything about what I just shared, Zach, or should I move on to another?
I will resist the very enticing just
Zach,
talk for
Zach,
20
don't resist.
No, I don't want to talk for 20 minutes about Charles Sanders Peirce, because that would be
I'll have another conversation about that if you want.
another conversation, because I actually kind of by accident became a Peirce expert. And I will say that he is one of the many kind of lost children of modernity seeking for lineage. And at the end of his life, this was his experience of mystical reunion with some of the faiths of his childhood, which were the faiths, of course, of Kant and Hegel, which were his true kind of like teachers. And so in that respect, he eventually found his way back in like a second simplicity to a form of faith, which is hugely embarrassing to the early Peirce scholars who want to see him as this reductive nominalist who kind of justifies science and boots a theory of semiotics that's useful in AI, and that's all true. But ultimately, his semiotics was a kind of logos mysticism. It was ultimately a kind of participatory evolutionary cosmology, which climaxed in the dimension of thirdness in religion. And so there's a deep strain there. I will say that, yeah, the move to the post-secular and the clarification of emergent post-secular discourse is the solution to this problem of planetary scale war and inevitable extinction, basically. And so that was kind of a convoluted way to say that there's world religion, which has to emerge. And philosophy assists that, science assists that. But it was a blip on the radar again in the context of modernity, and specifically, I would say, industrial socialization, that we started to believe as sociologists that religion would disappear because it was stupid. Now, the vast majority of the world never thought religion would disappear or that it was stupid. The small group of people who ended up creating the technologies that have driven us to the point of near self-extinction were the ones who basically tried to run religion out of the center of power. So,
and academic philosophy.
Yeah, so
right?
we're
those two matrices.
Yeah, so I can argue in a sense that we're in a religious war.
Yeah.
And the dominant religion in power that doesn't even call itself a religion is something like anti-humanism or transhumanism. Now, there are nice transhumanists who don't want me to use the term that way, so sometimes I just say anti-humanist, which is a broader term. But the truth is that that brand of scientific reductive materialism that is attempting to use AI to build Dyson spheres to collect all of the energy from the sun to build enormous data centers that we can upload our consciousness into and then explore the stars. And like, that's their geopolitical strategy in the near term. Like, nothing beats that. Nothing, no secular ideology and kind of like, we hold these truths to be self-evident type of stuff beats that. What beats that is something that's post-secular, which is what they've done in other societies like China, for example, who has returned to Confucianism, returned to Taoism, and India, which never went secular. India was like, oh, that's interesting, but we've got this whole thing we've been doing for a really long time.
Right.
Like specifically the West and the industrialized hyper-technological West flirted with the idea that you could run a civilization on nihilism. And this is the end of that experiment. And so the only answer to that is religion.
I mean, that's and Matt, you'll take us, inside into Cosmoerotic Humanism, but let's just say even Hamas. I mean, when I was in Israel, right, living next to, like, not next to, meaning a stone's throw, quite literally, from Qalqilia, right, on top of a hill in a settlement, what they were called, right outside of Kfar Saba, right, at what's called the Green Line. I would walk around Qalqilia, and I just said, you guys want to kill me, you can kill me, but I'm not going to carry my machine gun when I walk around. And I found a couple of the people related to Hamas, and I said, let's study text, right? Let's study together, right? And if we don't take, the various forms of Sunni seriously and the Shiite tract seriously, and if we don't read the texts and we just dismiss Islam, and we can't engage the Mu'tazila and the Ashariya, right? And actually understand the profound religious experience that's even at the center of the degraded forms, right? And find our way in that conversation, we have no chance, right? And so,
and if we counter them with science and commodity fetishism and like industrialization and like our pop culture and things, then we've just schismogenically made them more likely to occur.
Right.
So it's a very important move that Mark's describing. It's like countering religious discourse with religious discourse.
And they need to say that we're taking we're taking it all as seriously as they are.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not dismissible, right? And so, in some sense, that we just renamed Matt the Center for the Center for World Philosophy and Religion. It's had a couple of earlier names, but the point is we wanted religion to be front and center. And when we started it, we argued out the name. We just didn't want to put religion there. So we called it Center for World Spirituality in 2009 because we were being, appropriate, as we're supposed to be. And then we made it Center for Integral Wisdom. We said, just fuck this. Let's just call it what it is. It's Center for World Philosophy and Religion. And, a world religion as a context for our diversity based on, the best readings of the best philosophies and a serious reading of the primary texts, right, of the great traditions in, their best esoteric forms, on the inside of them, not through Houston Smith, right? In other words, let's actually read the text and have a conversation in the text, because in those texts, some of them are degraded in horrific ways. We all know that. Voltaire wasn't wrong when he said, remember the cruelties. There's a reason we left pre-modernity. We don't want to go back in any sense, shape, or form, but we can only move forward. And I mean, and the reason we're kind of crazy, kind of passionate about this is because, at least from our perspective, we don't see another way through. Right. And we've got these, it's why you asked so beautifully at the beginning of the conversation, like, does it matter that three guys are going to sit and talk about? Well, the answer is, like, matters unimaginably, right? I mean, we have to be the new Florentine Platonic Academy that are kind of actually with our eye to the world and we have to create this new world together. And we can't do it without just entering, and just killing ourselves on the altar of the text and the experiences and the phenomenologies.
Yeah. And again, like the assumption of the religious fundamentalist is that a conversation about value is not an arbitrary conversation. Right. Like, they're as serious about value as we are about, like, engineering, right? They just happen to have certain views that haven't evolved because no one else is willing to engage them in a serious conversation where value is not arbitrary. So we say, modernity says it's all emotion, like Max Weber, it's just sentiment. Like, there's just this reduction of religion to not something. It's not something where there are non-arbitrary conversations, which are about value, which means which ways of life are preferable to which other ways of life. Can we compare ways of life, open the eye of value, and see, right, that this set of doctrines results in. So, but we're not anywhere near that. Like, interreligious dialogue was basically not that. Interreligious dialogue accommodated remarkable type. Well, there's the type of pluralism that actually isn't taking the non-arbitrariness.
Jews who didn't believe in Judaism got together with Christians who didn't believe in Christianity, and they discovered they had a lot in common.
John Cobb wrote a book, Christ in a Pluralistic Age, and I think he was proposing, as many before him have, across traditions, that logos, the word, could be the basis for a true interreligious dialogue that takes value seriously, and this isn't just relativism. And what I hear you both saying, in answer to my initial question, what is the relevance of philosophy in the midst of geopolitical conflict and war? I think the proposal you're making is, well, we need to change history by enacting a new story of value. And I think study of sacred texts is a way of shifting from zero-sum rivalrous conflict to mutually enhancing, intensifying, deepening of value through the study of this shared history of revelation through the word. And I read the Torah, I read the New Testament, the Gospels, all the apocryphal texts, the Quran, which I admittedly haven't spent enough time with, all of Buddhist scripture. I mean, this is an ongoing revelation, and we all have a voice, to add to that symphony. And that doesn't mean we all agree with each other, right? There's discordance in music, and that's an invitation to find a higher harmony, right? And so maybe that's the moral equivalent of war, right? Is this deep study of sacred texts.
And here's the wild thing, Matt. If you actually look at the evolution of sacred texts, it's very clear that they evolve, right? It's very clear that they're not static. And as even the fundamentalist texts, which claim, right, that there's this kind of unchanging, but if you actually sit in serious study of text, right, and trace things over time, you realize, that, this prophet said this in this context, and wow, now we're 400 years later in this hadith, right, and now we're saying something kind of entirely different, and then you create this context of shared intimacy in the actual gnosis and eros of study, and then and we take each other seriously, right? Instead of basically, what we essentially do is we dismiss the phenomenological experience of most of the world as being fictitious and contrived, and yet think that we have a chance of averting world catastrophe without even having a shared phenomenological experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I tried to do in that essay on your book was to introduce Whitehead's account of propositions. And he points out and he references scripture and says, look, the point in reading a proposition in scripture is not, or in Hamlet and in Shakespeare, it's not, is it true or false? And he thinks that the reduction of propositions to just this logical binary, true or false, is a tremendously short-sighted error in itself. It's more important, he says, that a proposition be interesting than that it be true, that it provoke interest, that it provoke enjoyment, eros, and that it, as a result, again, regardless of whether it's true or false in some simplistic correspondence theory of truth sense, does it ingress novelty into the world in a way that enhances the expression of value in the world?
This is
Right.
another idea that I would say that he took from Charles Sanders Peirce, but that's another.
Well, Whitehead claims there's a letter to Charles Hartshorne. Hartshorne showed him Peirce's papers because Hartshorne was editing them at Harvard when Whitehead was there. And Whitehead says, "You have to promise that you're just showing this to me now because I have not." He read Peirce's his mathematical work very early, but not his philosophy. So I think it was an independent convergence. But
that would be interesting because he very specifically, Peirce, talked about different kinds of hypotheses and propositions and differentiated between those that were just accurate and true, but didn't foster the imagination or make the world have more kind of like connotation and meaning. And then those hypotheses, which actually did that. So it's very similar, but we don't have to.
Yeah,
I love them both. That it's not a rivalrous thing.
And again, we need new language.
Yeah.
Right. Because when we say interesting, right, and I underline that, in your paper, when we say interesting, we're still playing with the as if thing, right? And it does it make the world more radiant, right? Is it more alluring, right? A primary category in the Solomon lineage is this notion of cheshek, right? So an object, a chefetz, an object, right, is the word chefetz all means allurement, right? Allurement or desire. The name of God, the four-letter name of God, is right reality as configurations of desire, configurations of allurement. So, so let's move to a world that's obviously, close to your heart. You said you identify as a process philosopher, and by the way, Zack and I had a lovely correspondence with David Ray Griffin at the end of his life. He couldn't talk anymore, which we found him at the end, and he loved Cosmoerotic Humanism, and he said to us, "Whitehead approves," right? So that was very sweet, but obviously, the notion of allurement is strong in Whitehead, or the lure of feeling, or the lure of, and that sense of allurement, it's a different word, right? In other words, I have to clarify my allurement. In Luria, 16th century, the clarification of allurement is the fundamental moral act, right? So if we say something that's alluring to us, and it's alluring not to our surface structures, but if we can borrow that term from the perennialists, so I'll make that distinction, but it's alluring to our depth structures. It's not just my desire, but it's what Mordechai Leiner, student of the Baal Shem Tov, calls my deepest heart's desire. It's my clarified desire, right? So this arouses my desire. So, and I think that's what you mean by interest, meaning you don't mean interesting in a kind of vapid. You mean this is interesting.
Yeah.
So we need languages.
Right. So just to sort of maybe close up this initial exploration, we can move on. I want to talk about consciousness a bit, but it seems like Hegel kind of threw in the towel and said, philosophy just describes history, and Marx inverts that and says, no, we're supposed to be changing history, but through the changing of the means of production, the base, and not the superstructure. And you guys are pointing to the superstructure. We need a new story. And I think the enactment of a new story of value at the level, again, of the word, of logos. Logos and participation in that is not just interesting, it's transformative, it's enlivening, it's erotic, it's creative. Yeah.
It's all of that, right?
And we need there's human beings have been, as you two were describing earlier, we've been hoodwinked by this, you call it pseudo eros, this sort of capitalist consumerist myth of progress, technological progress, which reminds me there's a bellicose philosopher named Carl Schmitt who talked about technology neutralizing politics. So the idea in the modern industrial world is that technology is value neutral. And we can all agree, regardless of our religious or political orientations, about what sorts of technological improvements might be brought about, as if there aren't ethical consequences to every technology. Um, Right. And so that technology has become a kind of maybe techno-capitalism has become a pseudo religion and a source of pseudo eros that's distracting us from this other form of deeply, I think, motivating and inspiring engagement that could unite the human community across differences, not eliminating those differences, as you're always pointing out, but allowing us to understand ourselves better by entering into this deeper level of communion in a field of value. Um, yeah, it's beautiful and powerful stuff. One of the propositions that you two lay out um, at the beginning of this book is that you say the basic premise here, page 10, is that value and consciousness need to be added to the list of what counts as fundamental to the cosmos. And there's a little footnote. You mentioned Ian McGilchrist's work. You mentioned German idealism, Kabbalah, and Whitehead as supporting this idea. Now, the question I have for you two in relation to this consciousness being fundamental, that implies that the human, does this imply that the human being is not just sort of the product of an evolutionary process, but something more like the very medium of of evolution's expression, right? Does that question make sense? That it's or maybe it's both in some interesting way, right? But if consciousness is fundamental, then the human being seems to be the locus of the most intense consciousness on the earth. Maybe. Does that make us, again, the end product of a process that didn't include us at the beginning, but some proto form of experience or whatever? Or is in some sense the human being present at the beginning and evolving all the way through, that this is truly an anthropocosmic situation and not a cosmos that happened to produce a human being as one of its products?
Right. Zach, should I dive in? You want to dive in?
I can dive in.
Sure. You go first. I'll go after.
It was modernity disqualified the universe, so it removed value and consciousness, basically, and it left, space, time, causality. It actually left a bunch of stuff, but took those out, right? So philosophers got really interested in trying to add consciousness back in first, especially Western philosophers late in modernity who were obsessed with philosophy of mind that talked about consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness. This is a big deal, very complicated. But that's never how the problem really emerged and was discussed. Like Kant didn't think about consciousness in the way that David Chalmers did. Kant was actually a little bit more worried about value and how to argue for a value realism.
Right.
So what we've done for some
and fully understood that space and time are ejecta of human consciousness and couldn't exist without it.
The subject doesn't collapse reality, as it were, without value, which is the third critique, but we don't have to get into that. But the broader point is basically that the move we made some years ago was to kind of get out of the consciousness arguments about is consciousness there or not there, and into this
Value.
Where value is more fundamental even than consciousness, and so therefore consciousness emerges in service of value, right? But so the equally primordial thing becomes this interesting paradox at the very beginning of everything. So, but our argument will be that at least they're equal primordial, but probably something like value / desire / eros value, sometimes we speak of, would be the thing that would make consciousness kind of want to be there. It would make consciousness make sense. What is consciousness aware of? It is aware of that which it values, that which is there before it emerges. So it gets really weird and hard to talk about. But yeah, I think it's more useful, even in conversations in the philosophy of mind, And this is a point that Robert Brandom makes echoing Wilfred Sellers, which is that the problem isn't the problem of sentience. The problem is one of sapience, which means it's not about the emergence of awareness. It's not super interesting, actually. It's about the emergence of value, and specifically normativity, and specifically the radically counterfactual normativity that drives moral and scientific progress. So this is one way to think about, oh yeah, you guys are missing the point with that hard problem. Okay, great, consciousness, everything's aware. But how do we think about the moral law and the emergence of logic itself and the presuppositions that allow for science to be deemed as something that reveals truth? These are issues of value, way beyond, much harder to tie to a physical substrate, actually, than just awareness, which happens to be basically ubiquitous. So this is supplanting that hard problem with a harder problem, which is the problem of sapience, right? And so that to me is a very important frame. Yeah. And so the first principles, first value stuff suggests, yeah, personhood goes all the way back. All these things go all the way back. So in one sense, what you're saying is true, but in another sense, there's a deeply emergent evolution of all of the first principles and first values. So it's a little weird also to say, right? Of course, that personhood goes all the way back. And we talk about Ken, almost every time we talk to Ken, we argue about, like Ken Wilber, like, you know, which, can you really say it's personhood or is it consciousness, value, eros? Like, we're like, what is it really back at the core? But it's certainly not just matter and time and space. That's for,
I mean, and if you just to pick up on, you know, and we'll be kind of two dimensions of a voice here, you know, different sides of David J. Temple. You know, we by the way, Matt, just to say, we've never met him, but occasionally he'll like leave us a note, or he'll give us a call. We'll meet him at a bar. He'll be like shadowy, like in the. But anyways, that's a different conversation. We're not even sure if he's a man or a woman. It's unclear, but you know, we'll figure that one out. So when we think about, and just pick up Zack on that sentence you said that's really important, right? In other words, it's not that time and space are co-primordial with value. It's that value is underneath time and space, right? Mm-hmm. So, and when we stop talking about consciousness, it's because the conversation around consciousness had become so confused, you know, on so many different levels. So somewhere about 2016, we literally just said, okay, we're not going to talk about consciousness anymore. We're going to talk about value, right? And, you know, when we talk about value, so we used to say, you know, eros is a value of cosmos. Eros is value, and value is filled with eros. And just to speak kind of in, you know, sometimes we cite books, but, you know, we forget that things that are written in books come from people who've had an experience. So let's just go with the experience now in a kind of direct way. So, right, eros, we feel eros as a value of cosmos. And when we say eros, we mean something very specific, right? Eros as the experience, as you were reading the last couple of days, we were reading each other. Eros as the experience of radical aliveness, desiring ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness, which in turn generates ever more value. So that's the eros equation. So, but at some point we realized, no, it's not eros, it's eros value. That it's actually terminologically inappropriate to split those words in any way. Right? That eros value is the substrate of cosmos, and that everything emerges from it. Now, you know, we know that human science works because it's in some sense a human cosmos, right? We know that value, so if we take, let's say, the eros equation, or we take the intimacy equation, intimacy, shared identity in the context of of relative otherness, relative in a bracket, times mutualities of recognition, mutualities of pathos, mutualities of value, and mutualities of purpose. So shared identity, relative otherness, and then mutualities of recognition, feeling, value, and purpose. That intimacy equation applies to the three of us, can apply in this context right now. It can apply to divisions within General Motors that are trying to get a car out that don't have shared identity, but it also applies 380,000 years after the Big Bang to, you know, the proton and neutron and the nuclei coming together with an electron. So they create an atom that has shared identity. It's in the context of otherness. They have recognition. They have shared pathos, obviously, shared value field, and, you know, and a shared, you know, sense of purpose. And it applies essentially, you know, we've given now about, it's in an upcoming book, right, which is basically 40 applications of the intimacy equation across every dimension of life. right? From, the most primordial all the way up and all the way down. So all of a sudden you can be welcome in cosmos, meaning the human being is not an accident in cosmos. The human being is fundamentally and essentially welcome in cosmos, right? We have an actual experience of being intended, right? And that there's a kind of fundamental human need and desire to be intended, right? To be recognized, right? To be chosen, right? To be desired, right? To be not just loved, but love adored, and to be needed. Right? And we call those the 6 core needs of Eros, right? Now, anthropologically, need and desire disclose ontology, meaning the split between phenomenology and ontology is, as I think all three of us know, overplayed. But phenomenology at its deepest core, right, discloses ontology. So there's a movement of need desire, which at the foundational levels of cosmos are not distinct. At the kind of foundational aspirational levels of cosmos, need and desire are pretty much the same. It's only in the middle where they get a little confused and split. So need and desire disclose ontology. So these needs that we have, right? So the need to be intended anthropologically is also telling me something, right, about the nature of reality. So if you read, let's say, the Sunni mystics, or you read Luria, and they're doing these very elegant cosmologies, but you want to trace back, right? Where does this all come from? Where do these very, very elegant, complex Lurianic systems come from? What you realize is that, and they'll always say, Matt, that pshat, the most elemental human experience, and sod, the most esoteric, are the same, right? So that the most elemental, right? Because actually what's happening is the mysteries are within us, and our most clarified experience of our own need and desire discloses ontology, because reality is desire, because the name of God, if we'll use kind of those terms, is desire. So if I have a need to be intended, meaning I have a need to experience myself as welcome in the universe, that's actually disclosing my being welcome in the universe, right? I mean, in other words, my imagination is desperate to be intended, and God is, in your terms, let me do a Matt rhetorical move, right? God is a figment of our imagination, but our imagination is a figment of God, right? So like that. So this kind of very beautiful, inherent dialectic of radical evolution as a value of cosmos, and yet it's a human cosmos in this kind of fundamental way.
Yeah. I would not ever say that God is a figment of our imagination. I would say God is the ferment of imagination. God is the aim of our imagination. Yeah.
Comma, our imagination is a figment of God. I gave you the whole sentence.
Sure.
Right? No, totally.
Yeah, no, I love this. This need and desire thing is very this dialectic, this polarity, I think, is very important. And while you were speaking, I was thinking of what Heraclitus says about the way up and the way down are the same, right? The highest and the lowest correspond, is the old Hermetic maxim as well. And thinking also of Whitehead's affirmation, an ironic affirmation that he says we have no right to deface the value experience, which is the very essence of the universe. Existence in its own nature is the upholding of value intensity, right? And he talks about the need that any experiencing being has for a relationship of value, a value relationship to others and to the whole, and that as a self we are the achievement of value, right? And so value, as the you guys argue several times that value is or David argues that value is the origin of life. It's not that life is the origin of value. And similarly, consciousness, as we usually think of it, is an expression, a very high intensity expression of value. And so I hear you trying to hold this tension between, the idea of these levels of emergence, of ever deepening capacity for the realization of value and intimacy, while also saying that there's a through line here, and that value is the basis of it. I wonder, Yeah, maybe indulge me for a minute. I have a couple of friends here with me, Whitehead, of course, and Schelling's Ages of the World. And for Whitehead, this term consciousness, I think he uses it in a way over a century ago that was prior to all this confusion that comes with the hard problem of consciousness, where it's like, oh yes, we have a well-behaving mechanistic universe, and then somehow these conscious beings ended up here, and we got to figure out how to glom that on to the rest of the universe that we otherwise understand and can explain, which just totally neglects the philosophical presuppositions of science, that we must live in a universe that makes intelligent reflection upon that universe possible. So it can't possibly just be a machine. But Whitehead has a very specific definition of consciousness that avoids all of that confusion. For him, consciousness is a high-grade form of feeling, and it's feelings all the way down for him, pan-interiority, right? But consciousness for him specifically refers to what he calls the feeling of negation, or sometimes the affirmation negation contrast. Contrasts are a very important form of feeling for Whitehead. And so only some occasions of experience are conscious, in Whitehead's specific sense, where we're not just perceiving what's present or feeling the givenness of the past. A conscious experience is also aware of or prehending, feeling in his terms, everything that could be. So it's aware of this contrast between what's already been realized and the ideals that could be, that might be, that should be even, right? That's for him what typifies consciousness. But listen to what he says here, very beginning of Process and Reality about consciousness. He says, philosophy is the self-correction by consciousness of its own initial excess of subjectivity. Each actual occasion contributes to the circumstances of its origin additional formative elements deepening its own peculiar individuality. Consciousness is only the last and greatest of such elements by which the selective character of the individual obscures the external totality from which it originates and which it embodies. An actual individual of such higher grade has truck with the totality of things by reason of its sheer actuality, but it has attained its individual depth of being by a selective emphasis, limited to its own purposes. The task of philosophy is to recover the totality obscured by the selection. So on Whitehead's definition, consciousness is having to perform this double role, recognizing its own limitation, its own status as a limitation of the totality. But in recognizing that, becoming capable of self-correcting that limitation so as to become more sensitive to and rationally adequate to that totality, right? And so is his use of consciousness more helpful here, or do you think it's better just to speak in terms of value?
Zack, I spoke last, so you're up, and I'll pick it up after.
I haven't actually read Process and Reality in a long time, but when I'm hearing that, I'm hearing James,
Yeah.
and I'm hearing Peirce and their definitions of consciousness, which had to do with the early psychological work that was done in the reflex arc and by people like George Herbert Mead, which had to do specifically that consciousness emerges in the presence of error, meaning basically precisely in the awareness that your hypothesis about what the world is going to do doesn't do that, right? And in attachment theory, we know that is like very important. When all of a sudden you bite the blanket and you bite your finger and you realize there's this difference, and then mom's coming and going and you're not always right about when she'll show up, and sometimes you really want her there but she's not there. All of this is what brings you into self-awareness as a result of your error. And there's a very specific place where Peirce says that. He's basically like, in terms of semiosis, if we could see all of it, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about consciousness. That's like the God mind or something. He's like, for me, it's about this uniqueness that's specified through the characterization of what I'm lacking, which I become aware of more and more. So very much a sentiment of that 1890s kind of like psychology, which was phenomenological, meaning like they were seeing something about what the light of consciousness as we have it, its relationship to uniqueness, and its relationship to error, which means you're trying to fucking do something. So that's where value is smuggled in to this definition. And that's the Jamesian notion too. We're always at play. We're always in process of things, which means to think in terms of error. You failed at doing something. That's the way Peirce and Mead would characterize it. The reflex arc is hypothesis, action, meet the world, hypothesis confirmed or disconfirmed, retool, try again. And that is the reflex arc. And then that moves across the Atlantic to Piaget, who eventually turns that into something that's very resonant and consonant with this whole worldview as well, is actually the Piagetian metaphysics, which is very much like Piaget's, and the similar notion that like the interiorization and the growth of consciousness at the same time. You need the uniqueification of consciousness, and then it goes so deep that it becomes universal consciousness through the uniqueness. Very much. Yeah. I mean, I said that in light of having read Marc, of course. So I just said basically unique self theory, but there's a way that what they're seeing is the reality that we're all trying to triangulate, and there's been clarity over these years. And this question of phenomenological early approaches of psychology being dead to lineage phenomenology is actually not a trivial thing, given the place that emerged in Germany and the people who were involved with the early psychology. So there's like this whole historical thing behind what you were talking about with Whitehead's definition of consciousness. Is it useful? Yeah, insofar as it showed us that consciousness actually means value. It's actually like coded text for value. Please.
Yeah. No. That's no. Everything just, is it okay? I'll just pick up on that exact phrase, brother. Right. In other words, and earlier, you mentioned, Matt, the need, which I think is completely right for. We're precisely the opposite of an ivory tower, right? There's this, if we can use a term that we don't use often in philosophy, there's desperation. Right? There's a desperation for gnosis today, and so choosing our language, just like between beloveds, the right language that I choose is the language of seduction, right? But by seduction, we don't mean unholy seduction. Leiner makes this distinction implicitly, not based on what he says, but based on the sources that he cites. When you read a Hasidic text, you have what the text says, and then you have little parentheses where it cites the source. And one of the ways that texts code what they're saying is that the text will say something, but then it'll cite a source that actually is saying something quite different, which then makes you realize that what the text is saying is not what you thought it was saying. So so one of the ways they talk, but let's see if I can kind of grab this. So the language of consciousness, as we said in the beginning, and has gotten so confused. And, Whitehead, it's obviously been, remarked, in a number of places that, a writing course might have helped, but then of course it'd be so much less gorgeous. I have done some reading recently because I've kind of had to, just because over the last, 20 years, I'll say something and there's always someone who says, did you read that thing in Whitehead? So, so I've, over the years, I've kind of, taken a look at, Process and Reality and obviously other texts. But the sense of value, right? So let's say when we talk about a classical position of separate self, a skin encapsulated ego, and then we go to kind of a more classical true self, right? And a theory of self. So the assumption is that true self is awareness. Now, let's just do a strange anthropological move, right? The word awareness, what does it do in our body? Awareness, not much. Right? It's not that arousing, right? And I'm using arousing as a terminus technis, in Hebrew literature, which is air. I mean, it's not that awakening, right? It's not that interesting, if we can go back to that term. So actually, if you look carefully at the lineages, both of Abhinavagupta, Kashmir Shaivism, the whole school of kind of Rumi's contemporaries who are writing, kind of their literatures, very, very clear in the Solomonic lineage within the Hebrew wisdom, is that it's not actually awareness. It's what we talked earlier. It's awareness and allurement, or really awareness and desire. And of course, you referenced earlier kind of the Krishna world, right? So we're talking about Sat Chitananda, right? So we've got Sat, and then the inside of, Sat is Chit, right? So the inside of, being is consciousness, and then the inside of consciousness is Ananda, right? So the inside of the inside, which the Solomonic lineages calls lifnai b'lifnim, literally the inside of the inside, which is the description of the temple space. The inside of the inside is the two cherubs, right, above the ark, right, in the temple. So, Raiders of the Lost Ark, let's just let the ark stay lost. But no, but that ark has these two temples. And then you have this voice of divinity coming from the empty space between the centrally intertwisted cherubs. So disclosure, right? Mystery discloses itself in the empty space between the cherubs, and the cherubs are desire, clarified desire. So the space, so it's not aware, true self's not awareness. True self is the field of awareness and allurement, which then discloses itself as unique self, meaning the irreducible uniqueness, meaning I've now met Matt. So Matt is God's unique intimacy, and I'm never going to ever be confused ever in the rest of my life. I'm never going to meet someone else and think, oh, is that Matt if it's not Matt? Right? It's just that, and it's not because his t-shirt, it's because there's this configuration, this quality of Mattness, which is his unique set of allurements and his interests, if you will, his yearnings that are just have this unique configuration, which is the source of his dignity, and which then generates for the divine, if you will, or for, we call the name we're trying to, to kind of articulate when we call God's name, if you will, is God is the infinite intimate. God is the infinite intimate, right? So Matt becomes an irreducible, unique expression of God as the infinite intimate, and it's an unmistakable quality in which Matt actually adds to the divine. And that's where we go back to your, right? And it's the participation, right? There's literally more God to come, right? And then I can be excited about meeting Matt, because I'm not supposed to be Matt, right? And then jealousy disappears, then rivalry, conflict disappears. No, I get to be excited, right? About, I'm going to meet this new quality, right? That's not Zackness and it's not Markness. And it's this other kind of wildly delightful, play that I get to be allured to in this wonderful, and we get to love each other again. Like, we can live in that world. We can be welcome in that world.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Zack brought in the developmental psychology part of this and the scientific background to what Whitehead was saying. And mythopoeically, I couldn't help when you mentioned error to think about the role of sin and the tree of knowledge and the way in which consciousness is this result of error.
That was not lost on Peirce. That connotation was not lost on Peirce. So you're exactly right
right.
Yeah. And that's the Garden of Eden. I mean, we're in the middle, Zack, of the Garden of Eden story. Right? The Garden of Eden story is not a fall. It's error is the gate to becoming human.
Yeah.
The store in which we become human.
Right.
Please, man. Yeah.
Felix culpa, as St. Augustine put it, in the way that without sin, there's no knowledge. And it's only through knowledge that we in consciousness that we can love freely, right? Not just as a necessity, but as a decision, which if, in terms of cosmic plot lines, that seems to be at the core of this. Okay, so consciousness and personhood are deeply related, probably, but you do talk about personhood specifically in your text, and I thought of again some lines from the beginning of Schelling's unfinished Ages of the World. One of the drafts, I forget which one this was, the 1815 version, maybe.
I actually have that book right here, weirdly enough, Matt.
Oh, nice work. Translated by my friend Jason Worth. But yes. So Schelling says, and there's an interesting translation choice here that we can talk about that Jason makes, but Schelling says, a principle that is outside and above the world must be granted to the person. How else could the person alone among all creatures trace the long trail of developments from the present back into the deepest night of the past? How else could the person alone climb up to the beginning of the ages if there were not in the person a principle of the beginning of the ages? Created out of the source of things and the same as it, the human soul is conscientious of creation. And the German there is Mitwissenschaft. He translates that as conscientious, wanting to bring consciousness and a kind of sense of knowing with, but also the conscience is a sense of the ethical, moral dimension of that. The human soul is conscientious of creation. In the soul lies the highest clarity of all things. and the soul is not so much knowing as knowledge itself. And so there's a kind of I hear Schelling saying that the human soul is a microcosm, right? And that when we do this kind of evolutionary cosmology, we're never just trying to sort of abstractly reconstruct a model of how the exteriors of the universe have agglomerated over the course of billions of years. We're actually tapping into our own memory. And I think there's a way in which taking that maneuver seriously, not just as an as if, but as an actual method that we can engage in to understand this universe from the inside out and the evolutionary process as a moral unfolding and not just a physical unfolding, that changes everything.
That changes it.
Beautiful. Yeah, I would say,
Please.
Matt, like there's
That's Cosmoerotic Humanism.
that's kind of that's
Yeah.
and it's right. There's a saying that Theo Dawson, one of my teachers, said, the insight of psychology is that you're every age you've ever been. Basically, if you don't really understand yourself, if you don't realize you're every age you've ever been. And one of the things we're saying here with the kind of universe story is that you are also every age the universe has ever been. Like the entire embedded compound individuality of your unique occasion contains the memory of the entire universe. You are every age that the universe has ever been. And that reconfigures the phenomenology of your most essential values and your most essential feelings, meaning that the traits that are characteristic of you, some of them are arbitrary cultural, but some of them are actually the traits of the universe itself, right? So your love, your purest heart's desire is not just like your opinion, man, or the result of your cultural indoctrination. Neither would be at a more fundamental level. For example, you're desiring when you were an infant to be attached to your mother and to receive her care, right? That is not just like your opinion, man, or culture. That's a deep embodied proof that the universe runs on optically real love.
Right.
And so similarly, it's that ability to look back at the universe and realize that there was nothing arbitrary that led to the emergence of the human. There was a lot of chance or something. There's some semantics I'm doing here, but there was nothing that was arbitrary. Doesn't mean it was perfectly well planned out. No, that's a stupid idea.
Yeah. Well, in Peirce's sense, chance means play. There's free play.
And then it starts to lock in these patterns. So the habit formation in the Peircean semiotic cosmology, that habit formation is value. What is selected for and stays in the universe is what is valued by the universe, right? Mm-hmm. And this is like one of the insights we had some time ago, that selection theory,
right?
Meta theory within evolutionary theory itself. There's all these different ways of thinking about why something survives in the universe. The underlying thing of all of that is, what does the universe value, right? What's the appetite of the universe? And we're here, this human form is here, our brain, everything. The language I'm speaking is here because it was valued by the universe. It's like almost that simple. So therefore I completely belong. And my clarified desire, which would clarify my personality, would then make my personality a unique self expression of the universe rather than expression of, something that can be taken or like that you could take it or leave it, that it's some arbitrary outcome of human socialization. No, there are very, very profound states of wisdom in which the cosmoerotic kind of anthropological, transmogrification, I think would be the word. That might be the right word, which would be the recreating of the embodied form to fully exemplify those traits, right? This would be the unique self evolutionary enlightenment model.
Yeah. Let me just add before Mark jumps in. This isn't just that, personalities are made of more than memories. We have anticipations and expectations and desires. And so also in this anthropocosmic sense, in our own inner experience and longing is some sense of where the universe itself could go. I mean, the future is open, but there's a reality in our longing for what could be that also has a cosmic basis to it, right?
Yes.
It's not just arbitrary.
That is like literally it makes me just happy in the intimate universe. I was gonna begin with something like that in different language. So I was just that, and that's so exactly right and beautiful. I mean, remember Gabriel Marcel, once wrote, "Hope is a memory of the future," right? And Nachman of Breslov, his first kind of religious act in the morning is not prayer or a meditation. He calls it Zichron Alma Da'ate in Aramaic, to remember the future world. Right. So and Zack and I are just putting out a book that we wrote like, I don't know, 7 years ago, and got too caught up trying to think of the next stages to publish, but it's called Remembrances of the Future, right? Obviously, playing with that. So this notion of memories of the future and memories of the past, is critical. And by the way, even in terms of attachment theory, before we get to kind of just a note on that is critical. We think we can heal people by helping them recover the memory of the past and reorganize them, which is the psychological self, which by itself was a momentous evolutionary leap. We realized, oh, those women in Vienna that Breuer was seeing were not crazy; they were abused, and we can recover the past and reorganize, which is gorgeous and sacred. And at the same time, it's ultimately ineffective, right? It's actually a necessary step. The recidivism rate is unimaginable today, right? In clinical institutions right across the world. And we've been for the last 10, 15 years at the think tank in very close touch with that part of the world. And one of the things we're developing is something called unique self-recovery, right? Which is about recovering the memory of the future. And if I just recover the memory of the past and I don't recover the memory of the future, I actually can't heal, right, in a fundamental way. But maybe just to bring it back to center just for a second, if we can just schematize it for a second, because one of the great kind of epistemic confusions, right, is this confusion between separateness and uniqueness. And separateness and uniqueness are two utterly distinct experiences. So we have this Western Enlightenment idea that says the source of our dignity is in Western Enlightenment, is in our separate self. And therefore, we need to kind of affirm that. And of course, Eastern or mystical enlightenments will locate the source of our dignity in moving beyond separate self, right, and coming to this kind of place of true self. But both of them are based on an epistemological error between separateness and uniqueness, because actually the source of my dignity for the West shouldn't be separate self, it's unique self, right? And in the East, right, I want to move beyond my separate self, but not beyond my uniqueness. Right. And so to distinguish, to realize that there's a seamless code of the universe that's seamless but not featureless, right, is essential. And that confusion between separateness and uniqueness both confuses the Western Enlightenment tradition and the Eastern one. So what we're essentially, our kind of first dive into theory, before we got to value, was kind of, to kind of read Taylor 30 times and his opus on self, like we all needed to do it at some point in the world, and then try and articulate this unique self theory, which at its very core is this notion of the infinite intimate incarnate in the irreducible unique individual, who is a kind of higher individuation beyond ego. So what we're saying is there's not, you use the word, in this, in your short, very, very lovely essay, personality. And we're not in love with that word just because personality is so obviously separate self. So it doesn't matter. It's a semantic move, the way we use it. But we like the word personal, and personhood.
Sure.
And then you can kind of talk about, the personal. And then I move into kind of the impersonal, but really it's not really the impersonal, because the impersonal itself is suffused with allurement, but it's a kind of a field of allurement. And then I go, right, I would say to the transpersonal, that's too confusing of a word. Again, it's a confused word, the transpersonal. I actually return to the personal beyond the impersonal. Right. So unique self is a reclaiming of the personal, right, in a much deeper and broader, right, sense. And the personal is the intimate, right? And we then kind of begin to understand that uniqueness is, separateness, is the coin of alienation, while uniqueness is the currency of connection. So that actually all and everything, whether we're talking about, systems theory, right, or anything, we could talk about this forever. Let me stop here, but the dignity of the irreducible unique self who contains the whole world, right, is called by the lineage And this is an unwritten book that I never got to write, but in an earlier part of life, when I thought the only thing worth doing was talking to people who were good readers of Aramaic texts. I couldn't figure out why you would even talk to anyone else, right? There's a text in the book of Job, which is through my body, I vision God. Through my body, I vision God, which is really, really the beautiful passage that you just read from Schelling, right? Is the interpreters of that text within Hasidism, the book that needs to be written is a history of that text, over a couple of thousand years. What that text comes to mean is this realization that I'm both an irreducibly unique expression of the whole thing, that I'm not just unique self, but I'm actually evolutionary unique self. That is to say, I add something to the whole thing that it didn't have before, and that I have the capacity to actually, in the tikkun, in the fixing, not just to fix that which is broken, right, but to actually add an irreducible quality of perfection to that which is already perfect. But even though it's already perfect, it must still be perfecting, because ever perfecting is a quality of perfection, right? And I then become the incarnation of that new perfection, right? In other words, Zackness or Kathiness or Mattness. So that that can only happen because it all lives inside of me. So I'm both an irreducibly emergent expression of it. It all lives inside of me. And then I become literally the amorous cosmos in person, right? Writing its next chapter through my story. We might not get to story today, but the prism is story, which is feeling. All consciousness value all happens within this context of the ontology of story of plot line. But that's takes us in a direction.
Time check. I mean, we've gone for 90 minutes. How are you guys doing? Do you have a few more minutes, or?
Zach, you okay?
Yeah, I got a few more minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, just, I mean, we won't get to story, but I want to stay on personhood for a second. Person from Latin personare, meaning a mask through which sound passes, right? And so mask makes it seem kind of ephemeral or make-believe, but I think the distinction between uniqueness and separateness is that the uniqueness of a person is established in relationship to other persons, where the face of a person, the mask through which the sound of the word passes, is, I think of it almost like the like the iconostasis in an Orthodox church, where the priest is moving in and out, opening and closing the door and the curtains, and this polarity or oscillation, better said, between revelation and concealment. And the mystery of personhood is very much about that. We speak to each other in a shared language and connect across our uniqueness in that through the word. And yet behind the word, when we're silent, is this mystery, this vast, this empty space, as you were referring to it earlier, where creativity happens. Whitehead says, our moment to moment experience is flitting about in the interstices of the brain. And he says, quote, empty space. So he doesn't really believe in empty space. That's empty space is the matrix of possibility, and where our awareness is, if you can put it that way. But personhood as this the way in which the divine can come into relationship with itself by wearing masks that aren't just make-believe, but the context within which value can be experienced and intensified. Yeah.
Z, you want to take it first? I think you're up in the order of things.
No, it was beautiful. I mean, of course, I think of the face as a portal, the Levinas, and I think of the key dharma, which Mark would deliver better than me, about the core of the practice of the clarification of desires getting on the inside of God's face. Meaning, what does it mean to be looking out at the world from the inside of God's face, but from your unique face, right? So there's this paradox in that sense of seeing God in the face of another. This is often said, often by Christians. I've heard it said, see God in the face of a stranger. You don't see some generic person. You see their uniqueness, actually. is what happens. By chance, you're walking through a crowd and you're trying not to see people's uniqueness, kind of, because you're trying to get your thing done. And flashing in front of you is the uniqueness of a face.
Right.
And that is that portal into the divine through the uniqueness of the face. And that is this profound insight, which I think you're touching on, that personhood showing of the face. And then also personhood, uniqueness of face. There's so much to that in terms of losing face, in terms of recovering, in terms of look at me. And attachment theory, the first conversation, of course, is with face to face. It's not language. It's not even often sound. It's just the incredible responsiveness of the mothering face to the infant face, the conversation of faces, similar to the conversation of faces during lovemaking, for example, when you're just in that, right? So there's this very deep interplay of the meeting of the faces. And so the fear we have of the kind of, the fear we have of the replacement of politics by a science of behavior control, right? This is what we write about in Exit the Silicon Maze, which is the fear we have of being made anonymous, being made to have no face, right? The non-player character meme, right? The non-player character meme is a faceless member of a crowd that has been automated into complacency and therefore anonymized and without face. And so very much the preservation of personhood is the preservation of the ability to kind of like have your face seen and to show your face, as it were.
Mark, you were saying now that you've met me, you'll always recognize me in the future, and I might need to recruit you to, once Google uses the thousands of videos of me to create the AI of me, I might need you as an authenticity checker. But
we have to bear witness for each other after all the witnesses are gone. The temple, one of the names for the temple is Pnima, the face. And as Zack actually it's one of the actual canonical names. And as Zack, as you pointed out, the word to be before the divine, lifne, and the word pnima, interiority, inside, and the word panim, face, are the same word. So to be before God is quite literally to be, as Zack said, beautifully, on the inside of God's face, right? And this kind of split between beforeness, second person, right, and this ultimate first and second person that kind of playing each other in this insanely beautiful way. I mean, feel into it. Just two thoughts. One, let's just be directly, if you will, kind of mystics of allurement, erotic mystics, or what sometimes we call evolutionary lovers. And I wrote an essay way back called Evolutionary Love, and Zack told me that Peirce had used that word before me, so he made me read the essay, which was annoying, but it's a beautiful essay. I like the word better, outrageous love, right? Because the word outrageous, it connotes something slightly different. Outrageous, and it's a term that was used in the Sabbatian strain of thought. Nathan of Aza, Shabtai Tzvi's prophet, who was kind of this kind of apostate messiah, but who, as Gershom Scholem, spent his life showing, influenced all of Hasidism and, found his way back in. And that was the first 3 generations of formal Kabbalistic scholarship was about that relation. So that there's this usage of ahava azah, outrageous love, this love that is the heart of existence itself, and not in the as if way, but in the ontological way. So let's just be in that as direct mystics. We can put what we learn in a book. So if I fall in love with someone, what happens when I fall in love with that person? What's my direct experience? So there's an emotion, there's a feeling tone, right? Because I'm participating in the universe, and love's not hard to find, love's impossible to avoid, and the universe feels love. But what's happening? What's happening is I'm seeing that person. There's a perception. Love at its core is a perceptive act, an imaginative act. So there's a perception, but there's not just a perception of the person of the beloved, but the beloved arouses a self-perception. So, for example, I can notice, there's a particular quality of intimacy that will show up when I'm talking, let's say, to Zack, that doesn't show up with any other person. So there's a dimension of Markness that shows up in that exchange that doesn't ever show up in any other way. In that same way, when Matt, as it were, shows up on the inside of God's face or before God, however you want to play the etymology, there's a new dimension of the divine that shows up in that relationship. So so anthropologically, you actually have a direct and clear sense, almost, our Tibetan Buddhist friends are kind of pointing out, right, of this ontological emergent of something that's unimaginably new. And then I begin to realize that I'm, who am I? Right? I'm unique self, meaning, I am an irreducibly unique expression of this love, intelligence, and love beauty, right? That's the animating eros and energy of all that is, right? That's living in me, as me, and through me, right? That never was, is, or will be ever again. And as such, I've got this unique quality of intimacy, this unique gift, this unique way of being and becoming, this unique, poem to write and song to sing and unique gift to give, right? That has never and can never be given than anyone other than me. I mean, that allows you to get rid of a decent amount of Prozac, right? I mean, in other words, it just, and to live without that is to live without dignity.
Yeah.
Without dignity.
Well, I'll let you guys go in a second here, but I just can't help myself in thinking about this, the importance of personhood for a cosmology that fosters intimacy. And, even non-theistic traditions like Buddhism still would talk about the Tathagatagarbha, the embryo of enlightenment in every person. And whether or not a term like God finds resonance in traditions like that, I think there's still resources for emphasizing the importance of personhood and intimacy. And what I hear in so much of what you've written and what we've discussed today is this sense that there's almost it's kind of a new argument for the reality of God. And, Peirce says really what we need is a poem as an argument in this case, rather than a logical proof for the existence of God, something that evokes the experience of that reality rather than some kind of, attempt to demonstrate it logically. We have St. Anselm trying to define God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But what you're suggesting is the God is that than which nothing more intimate can be felt, which is a different way of getting at this, and uh, almost a kind of phenomenological proof of the existence of the divine ground.
God is the infinite.
Infinite, yeah.
Calling the name of God infinite. And Zack, maybe on this one you'll finish. So I'll change the order for a second. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's we were talking yesterday and I don't generally, Matt, venture out of my cave, but Zack is schlepping me out of the cave to talk to people. We were talking yesterday. It was a very beautiful conversation with Ian McGilchrist, and we were talking about intimacy. And then Ian, kind of asked, of course, the right question, which is, well, what about the horrors of the world, right? And there was a particular moment. It's just a 10-second anecdote when back in 2011, I happened to meet Deepak Chopra in an elevator in the Brown Palace, and we started talking and story, kept in touch for a while, emailed for a while. So he sent me his book in 2011 called The War of the Worldviews, which he wrote with the professor from Caltech, and the Caltech guy, Leonard Milano was taking the kind of materialist position, and Deepak was taking the Cosmoerotic position, etc. But there's always a key text in a book around which everything else revolves. So on page, I remember it, I just happen to remember page 63, 64, Milano tells the story of his mother in a death camp, in which the Nazi commandant walks behind, his mother and 7 people kind of, kneeling in the snow, and, randomly and brutally shoots one and doesn't shoot the other. And Milano basically says, fuck your God, essentially, and without engaging that, the intimacy question doesn't begin. Yeah. And that's what's so intensely painful, but also so intensely beautiful, because none of us are willing to believe in our deepest anthropological knowing. I mean, Russell wrote about this in one of his letters. He says something like, even after I feel like I've, been unable to address the subjectivity of ethical values, I can't bring myself to believe that the only thing wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it. right? And so you can only be Abraham protesting the divine. You can only argue with the divine. You can only be Levi Isaac of Berditch of putting God on trial, right, for suffering in the world if you live in an intimate universe and God's the infinite intimate, right? In other words, if it's an as if world, right, of sincere irony, right, then there's no reason why, the border of India and Pakistan, 46 to 48, people aren't bashing their babies' heads against walls, for 2 years, because why would it be any different? So it's only the infinity of intimacy. God not just the infinity of power, but is the infinity of intimacy that allows us to then challenge the divine and be God's voice challenging the divine and actually scream that it can't be this way because I have a direct experience of the infinite universe. And Luria actually says, last sentence, Luria has this very, very deep notion in his tree of life that whenever you do particular acts, you merge with a different dimension of the tree. So he says the only time, this is elliptical in a number of texts, the only time that you actually merge with Keter Chochman Binah, with crown and wisdom and feminine understanding at the top three levels, is when you scream to God in protest. When you scream to God, demanding justice, furious with the divine, that's the highest level, right, of gnosis, right? Which is what you're pointing to, and that's at the core. Right? Evil is a failure of intimacy.
Right. And it provokes love as in response. Fierce love, even.
Paradoxically, the question itself is actually the answer. Not the answer, but the phenomenological door in.
Yeah.
That which we can't articulate the question.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. And no, I would say something about loneliness here, right? Because there's something about the loneliness epidemic similar to all the attachment disorders as kind of showing us that what we need is real. You like the solution from like a radically ascending consciousness only metaphysics is that there's no loneliness because there's nobody else. It's just you, just oneself. So why are you lonely? But that's actually terrible and incorrect. The solution to loneliness is the reality of the second person, both in others and in God, and therefore the reality of shared value and story. So I think the other thing to note here is that the argument for God has a lot to do with the ontology of story, which we've been flirting with in this conversation and never actually addressed. But different than the reality of absolute no story, which we're not saying there isn't some reality of absolute no story, but we are saying the reality of story, primary. And so what that allows for is a different way in to this problem of how to feel welcome in the universe. Not to annihilate the universe. You didn't solve the problem. You actually just removed the problem because you annihilated the universe. How do you be not lonely and welcome in the universe? Requires solving that problem, not dismissing the universe. And how do you have a story that is good, a story of a life that is not misspent, a story that is truly meaningful, is not to dismiss the category of story as itself illusory. So I'm agreeing with you. There's a definition of God, argument for God, which boots from something very different than the assumptions of materialists and I think radical idealists and spiritual escapists and a whole host of well-meaning attempts to try to solve this problem of loneliness and meaninglessness and moral obligation in a postmodern culture that hasn't given us the cultural resources to do that. So we're kind of trying to bring voice to that. And so I appreciate that as a way to end. Actually, it's very important.
Right. So relationality goes all the way down would be another way of talking about eros, or eros value. I forget which way you said it. Goes all the way down. Yeah.
And you can't even talk about it. And I know we're closing here, so one sentence, but the word consciousness actually doesn't exist without relationality. I mean, there's no value without relationality, and there's no consciousness, and reality is at its very core relationship, at its very essence.
The human being is conscientious with creation, not identical with, but in this relationship of co-knowing, co-valuing. Yeah.
As your friend used the word conscientious in that Schelling quote beautifully. Yeah. Nice, beautiful.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. This was not just fun, it was edifying and hopefully valuable for anyone listening, and keep up the good work. And I hope to talk to both of you again, and let's circle back about December and see if
Yeah.
that works.
Vermont.
Yeah.
Vermont for real.
Yeah.
Okay.
All
Okay.
right, guys. Take care.
Yay.